Today in the Daily Dose, the explorers. Jacques Cartier. Born in 1491 Saint-Malo, France, Jacques Cartier learned to sail as a young man, most likely voyaging to Brazil and Newfoundland under the command of Italian explorer Giovanni da Verrazzano, before Cartier's historic 3 voyages to the New World. 2 years after the Duchy of Brittany was made part of France in the Edict of Union, in 1534, King Francis I commissioned Cartier on an expedition to the Northern Islands, as the east coast of North America was then known, with the objective of finding a northwest passage to the lucrative trade markets of Asia, setting sail in April with 2 ships and a crew of 61 men. Exploring the west coast of Newfoundland, the St. Lawrence River and Prince Edward Island, giving rise to the name Canada when he misinterpreted the Iroquois word for settlement, Cartier returned to France with 2 captured Native Americans, minus any fresh knowledge of the still elusive Northwest Passage. The following year, the French king sent Cartier back across the Atlantic, this time with 3 ships and 110 men, employing his 2 captured Native Americans as guides for a more in-depth exploration of today's eastern coast of Canada, sailing up the St. Lawrence River as far as present-day Quebec, where he established a base camp to wait out what would prove to be a bitter winter of deprivation and death. By spring, 25 members of Cartier's crew had died from scurvy, while the once friendly Iroquois people turned against the French explorer when they concluded that his sole intention was to lay claim to their native lands. To deepen the bad blood with local Iroquois, Cartier kidnapped 2 chiefs before sailing home to France. Delayed by war in Europe until 1541, King Francis funded Cartier's 3rd voyage to the New World, 2 months in advance of nobleman Jean-François Roberval, who was charged with establishing a permanent colony in the Northern Islands. Arriving at present-day Quebec in August of that same year, Cartier and his crew endured another brutal winter, and when Roberval failed to show up at their planned rendezvous site, Cartier set sail for France with what he thought was a valuable cache of gold and diamonds, a bounty that later proved to be nothing more than worthless minerals. Encountering Roberval during a stop in Newfoundland, Cartier defied Roberval's orders to return to Quebec, instead setting sail for home under the cover of night. The decision ended Cartier's time as a French explorer, spending the rest of his life at his estate in Saint-Malo before passing away on September 1st, 1557, making Jacques Cartier an important trailblazer during the age of exploration. Francisco Coronado. Born in 1510 Salamanca, Spain, Francisco Coronado's status as a second son cut off any possibility of inheriting his family's estate, prompting him to seek his fortune in the New World. Sailing for present-day Mexico in 1535, under Spanish Viceroy Antonio de Mendoza, Coronado married the daughter of a former colonial treasurer, which earned him one of the largest estates in New Spain. 2 years later, his successful put-down of a rebellion by black slaves and Indians working in nearby mines landed him the governorship of present-day Jalisco, Nayarit, and Sinaloa. Early in 1540, the ever-ambitious Coronado learned of vast riches to the north in the somewhat mythical 7 golden cities of Cibola, convincing Mendoza to back him in an expedition made up of some 300 Spaniards and more than 1,000 Native Americans, setting off from Compostela for an arduous 4-month trek to the first city of Cibola, which proved to be the Zuni Pueblo town of Huica in present-day New Mexico. When the Zunis resisted Spanish attempts to subdue them, the better-armed Spaniards forced the Zunis to flee, yet not before Coronado was wounded by a stone. Failing to locate Cibola's mythical riches, Coronado split his forces into smaller search parties, which resulted in a group led by Garcia Lopez de Cardenas to become the first Europeans to sight the Grand Canyon, while a group led by Pedro de Tovar reached the Colorado Plateau. Wintering near present-day Santa Fe, New Mexico, in the spring of 1541, despite repeated attacks by hostile Indians, Coronado explored the Palo Duro Canyon in present-day Texas, before leading a smaller group into present-day Kansas. Returning to Mexico in 1542, Mendoza publicly dismissed Coronado's expedition as a failure, before opening two separate inquiries into Coronado's conduct as a leader. Cleared of all charges, Coronado was stripped of his governorship in 1544, passing away a decade later from infectious diseases acquired on his expedition north, making the life and explorations of Francisco Coronado a major contributor during the Age of Exploration. Samuel de Champlain. Born in 1574 Brouage, France, Samuel de Champlain traveled to Spain and the West Indies with his uncle, before accepting a job as a cartographer for King Henry IV from 1601 to 1603. Sailing to Canada in 1603 under the command of François Gravé Dupont, the group sailed up the St. Lawrence and Saguenay rivers, further exploring the Gaspé Peninsula before arriving into Montreal. Proving his usefulness on Dupont's expedition, in 1604, Champlain was named geographer on an expedition to Acadia under the command of Lieutenant General Pierre du Gademont, exploring present-day Nova Scotia, the Bay of Fundy, and the St. John River, before building a fort on a small island atop the St. Croix River to wait out the winter months. In the summer of 1605, Dumont's team sailed down the coast of New England to Cape Cod, where Champlain became the first European explorer to write a detailed accounting of present-day Plymouth, Massachusetts, a solid 15 years before English pilgrims settled in the region. Advancing to the rank of lieutenant under Dumont, in 1608, the group again explored the St. Lawrence, building a fort at present-day Quebec City, which would soon become the teeming heart of the French fur trade. Voyaging deep into the Canadian interior in 1615, Champlain and his team of Huron people attacked the Iroquois, resulting in the aggressors' defeat when Champlain took an arrow to the knee. Unable to walk, Champlain wintered with the Hurons near Georgian Bay, composing one of the most detailed accounts of its time of Native American life. Returning to France to face a withering string of lawsuits, Champlain composed a number of accounts of his voyages, replete with maps and illustrations, returning to Canada after his commission was reinstated, with a new wife 30 years his junior. Appointed governor of New France by Louis XIII's chief minister, Cardinal Richelieu, French control of the lucrative Canadian fur trade was soon displaced by the English, who lay siege to the fort until Champlain surrendered on July 19, 1629. Returning to France until the signing of the Treaty of Saint-Germain-en-Laye, which handed Quebec back to the French, Champlain returned to Quebec yet again as its governor, retiring in 1633 due to failing health, before passing away on Christmas Day, 1635, making the life and voyages of Samuel de Champlain a keystone figure during the Age of Exploration. James Cook. Born in 1728 Yorkshire, England, James Cook farmed beside his Scottish father until winning an apprenticeship with a merchant sailing company at age 17. Cutting his teeth in the turbulent waters of the North and Baltic Seas, at 26, he abandoned his promising merchant career to join the British Royal Navy, quickly rising in prominence as a cartographer during the 7 Years' War, where his detailed charts of the St. Lawrence River helped Britain pull off a surprise attack against the French. By the early 1760s, Cook was given command of his first ship, becoming the first man in British naval history to rise from the ranks of a common seaman to the commander of a ship. Best known for his 3 explorations of the Pacific Ocean, during his first voyage aboard HMS Endeavour from 1768 to 1771, Cook and his 100-man crew were charged with sailing to Tahiti to observe the transit of Venus across the sun, along with a sealed and quite secret order to find the great southern continent. Instead, he became the first European to chart the east coast of Australia, while proving that New Zealand was made up of 2 islands, rather than the tip of a larger landmass. Running aground on the Great Barrier Reef on June 11, 1770, Cook's crew fought for 20 desperate hours to staunch the leak, before limping to Australia for 2 months of repairs. During his second voyage aboard HMS Resolution and Adventure, Cook was yet again tasked with finding the elusive southern continent, Terra Australis, crossing into the Antarctic Circle, before ending the debate about a southern continent once and for all. Setting sail in 1776 aboard HMS Resolution and Discovery, the 47-year-old Cook searched for the elusive Northwest Passage in the Arctic, surveying the upper coast of western Canada and Alaska before turning south due to ice floes and a mutinous crew. Making repairs on the island of Hawaii, Cook attempted to kidnap King Kaneopalu after a group of natives stole one of his tenders, resulting in his death when he was clubbed, stoned, and knifed while attempting to flee to a waiting boat, making the life and explorations of James Cook a major contributor after the Age of Exploration. The Lewis and Clark Expedition. After President Thomas Jefferson successfully negotiated the Louisiana Purchase from France, Jefferson tasked his personal secretary Meriwether Lewis to explore the nation's newest lands west of the Mississippi. Lewis chose his good friend William Clark to co-lead the expedition, who in turn recruited and trained unmarried healthy men at Fort Dubois during the winter of 1803. On May 14, 1804, the Corps, as they became known, set out in keelboats down the Missouri River with 45 recruits, a French Indian interpreter, a contracted boat crew, and a slave named York. During their 8,000-mile journey, Lewis and Clark encountered nearly 50 Native American tribes, and while violence was rare, in September, the Teton Sioux attempted to block the group's boats by demanding a toll, which was quickly repulsed by the Corps' superior firepower. Wintering for 5 months after building Fort Mandan in present-day Washburn, North Dakota, Lewis and Clark hired Toussaint Charbboneau as their new interpreter, allowing the trapper's Shoshone wife Sacagawea to join the expedition, who would later prove invaluable to the Corps' survival. On April 7, 1805, Lewis and Clark sent a portion of their crew back towards St. Louis with a keelboat laden with zoological and botanical samples, maps, and letters, while the remaining party pushed across the Continental Divide and the Bitterroot Mountains, which exposed the group to frostbite, hunger, dehydration, bad weather, freezing temperatures, and exhaustion. Despite the brutal conditions, not a single man was lost. Reaching the Pacific Ocean in November of 1805, the expedition wintered near present-day Astoria, Oregon, building Fort Clatsop for a second hard winter to come, before heading for home on March 23, 1806. Splitting into 2 parties in Montana, Clark carved his name and date on a large rock formation along the Yellowstone River, which is now a national monument protected by the Department of the Interior. 2 days later, Lewis and his party faced off with 8 Blackfeet warriors near present-day Cut Bank, Montana, forcing Lewis's party to kill 2 warriors who attempted to steal weapons and horses. The 2 teams of explorers reunited on August 12th arriving back in St. Louis on September 23rd. Lewis and Clark's 2-year expedition produced invaluable maps and geographical information about the American Northwest, while returning home with some 120 animal specimens and over 200 botanical samples, making the Lewis and Clark expedition a landmark precursor before a young nation's all-out push for westward expansion. Toussaint Charbboneau. Born near Montreal around 1767, free trader, trapper, and explorer Toussaint Charbboneau lived among the Hidatsis and Mandan people for years as a young man, purchasing 2 wives from the Shoshone people, including his now famous wife Sacagawea. After Meriwether Lewis and William Clark arrived into Fort Mandan in late 1804, on March 11, 1805, the 2 explorers hired Charbboneau as their interpreter, and while Charbboneau initially declined their offer, he became the oldest member of the Lewis and Clark expedition at 38 years of age. Departing by boat with Sacagawea and his 55-day-old son Jean-Baptiste, during the 2-year trek to the Pacific Ocean and back, Charbboneau proved to be an excellent chef and a great negotiator with local Native Americans. Yet his skills as a waterman proved to be wildly deficient, and after he nearly capsized a pirogue filled with vital supplies, saved only by Sacagawea's quick thinking, Lewis wrote that Charbboneau was a man of little merit and perhaps the most timid waterman in the world. Upon the expedition's successful conclusion, Charbboneau was paid $533.33 and given a land grant for 320 acres. And since Clark had developed a deep affection for Jean-Baptiste, or Pomp as the young boy was known, Clark offered to raise the boy as his own and pay for his education. After living for the next 3 years with the Mandans, Charbboneau moved the family to Missouri, where he claimed his 320 acres. And after he grew weary of farm life, he sold his land to Clark for $100 before finding work with the Missouri Fur Company in Fort Manuel Lisa in the South Dakota Territory. During his absence, Sacagawea gave birth to a daughter named Lizette before passing away on December 20th, 1812, from an infectious bout of typhus. The following year, Charbboneau formally signed both his children into the custody of Clark. For the remainder of his life, surviving records from the Missouri Territory indicates that he was wildly disliked by others, primarily due to the fact that he repeatedly hired on with rival trading companies, including Lisa's Missouri Fur Company and John Jacob Astor's American Fur Company, while his reputation was further tarnished after he abandoned a third employer, James Kipp, while on a fur trapping expedition in 1834. Over the course of his life, Charbboneau had a total of 5 wives, all Native Americans who were 16 years or younger at the time of their betrothal, marrying his last known wife, a 14-year-old Assiniboine girl, when he was more than 70 years old. After his death in 1843, he was buried most likely at Fort Mandan, North Dakota, although others believe he was buried in Richwoods, Missouri, making Toussaint Charbboneau an important yet fallible human during one of the greatest expeditions in American history. Ernest Shackleton survives the South Pole. Sailing from South Georgia Island for Antarctica on December 5, 1914, 27 men set out for the South Pole, hoping to establish a base on Antarctica's Weddell seacoast. 2 days later, the HMS Endurance entered the pack ice, standing guard around the Antarctic continent, poking and prodding its way through leads in the ice until a January 18th northerly gale trapped the ship for the next 10 months to come. In the words of crewman Thomas Ord-Lees, the Endurance became frozen like an almond in the middle of a chocolate bar. Finally, on October 27, 1915, a new wave of pressure rippled across the ice, lifting the ship's stern and tearing off its rudder and keel, effectively crushing the ship's hull. Led by famed Antarctic explorer Ernest Shackleton, after salvaging what they could from the doomed ship, the crew's initial plan was to march across the ice toward land, but that was abandoned after the men managed just 7.5 miles in 7 days. Camping on the ice until conditions improved, slowly and steadily their ice floe drifted farther to the north, until on April 7, 1916, the snow-capped peaks of Clarence and Elephant Islands came into view. 2 days later, their ice raft broke apart, forcing the men to row in frigid conditions until they clambered ashore on Elephant Island. It would be the first time the men stood on dry land since leaving South Georgia 497 days earlier. After 9 days of rest and recuperation, Shackleton and 5 others set out in one of Endurance's salvaged lifeboats, the James Caird, facing off with a 16-day voyage through monstrous swells and angry winds, bailing water and beating ice off the sails as they ventured 800 miles back to South Georgia Island. Blown off course by fearsome winds, Shackleton and 2 others set off on foot, climbing over mountains and sliding down glacier fields for 30 hours, until they could reach help at the whaling station where they first departed. Meanwhile, the remaining crew hunkered down on Elephant Island, employing additional salvaged lifeboats to create what they called the Snuggery, surviving the bitter cold with ever-diminishing hopes of being rescued. After 2 failed attempts to navigate through the floes of pack ice, Shackleton procured a 3rd ship, the Yelko, and on August 30th, 1916, the saga of the Endurance and her crew came to an end. The men on the island were settling down to a lunch of boiled seal's backbone when they spied the Yelko just offshore. It had been 128 days since the James Caird had departed for help, ending 20 months of gutsy survival since the misadventure of the Endurance first began. Lucky Lindy, the first man to cross the pond. Born in Detroit in 1902, Charles Lindbergh took up flying at the tender age of 20. A year later, he bought a surplus World War I Curtiss Jenny biplane and toured the country as a barnstorming stunt pilot. In 1924, he enrolled in the Army Air Service Flying School in Texas and graduated at the top of his class. He became an airmail pilot in 1926 and pioneered the route between St. Louis and Chicago. In 1926, French entrepreneur Raymond Ortegue reoffered a prize of $25,000 to the first aviator or aviators to fly nonstop across the Atlantic from New York to Paris, a flight of some 3,600 miles over open water. In response, Lindbergh convinced the St. Louis Chamber of Commerce to front the cost of the flight, setting a budget of $15,000 in support of Lindbergh's objective. Ryan Airlines Corporation of San Diego volunteered to build the Spirit of St. Louis, which proved to be little more than a single-engine gas tank with wings. The main fuel tank was placed in front of the cockpit, which cut off Lindbergh's forward vision other than the addition of a periscope. To cut down on weight, all non-essential instruments were removed, including the radio, gas gauges, night flying lights, navigation equipment, and a parachute. Bad weather delayed Lindbergh's transatlantic attempt for nearly a week, but on May 20th, 1927, the Spirit of St. Louis struggled to lift off from the muddy grass runway at Roosevelt Field, so overloaded with fuel that the plane barely cleared the telephone wires at the end of the runway. On May 21st, halfway across the pond, Lindbergh entered a fog bank as he struggled to stay awake, holding his eyelids open with his fingers. He later confessed that he hallucinated about ghosts passing through the cockpit. After 24 hours of flying, he spotted fishing boats and knew he was close to land. He called down to them which way to Ireland. When he landed at Le Bourget Aerodrome in Paris, Charles Lindbergh became an international celebrity, strengthening the notion that one man with the right amount of daring and ingenuity could have an enormous impact on the world. President Calvin Coolidge dispatched a warship to bring the hero home. Upon his arrival in New York, Lucky Lindy was given a ticker-tape parade before being presented with the Congressional Medal of Honor. Amelia Earhart flies the pond. Born into a wealthy family in Atchison, Kansas, on July 24, 1897, Amelia Earhart developed a passion for adventure at an early age, steadily gaining flying experience from her 20s onward until her disappearance in 1937 during a Pacific Ocean flight from Lae, New Guinea to Howland Island. Nicknamed Lady Lindy after Charles Lindbergh's 1927 solo flight across the Atlantic, the following year, Earhart became the first woman to fly the Atlantic with pilot Wilmer Stoltz and co-pilot and flight mechanic Lewis Gordon, departing from Trepassey Harbor, Newfoundland, in a Fokker F-7B, landing near Buryport, South Wales, 20 hours and 40 minutes later. Since most of the flight was on instruments and Earhart had no training yet for that type of flying, when asked by a reporter if she helped fly the plane, she answered, "Stoltz did all the flying, had to. I was just baggage, like a sack of potatoes. Maybe someday I'll try it alone." She did just that 5 years to the day after Lucky Lindy's flight across the pond, flying from Newfoundland to Ireland in just under 15 hours. On the morning of May 20th, 1932, 34-year-old Earhart set off from Harbor Grace with a copy of the Telegraph-Journal newspaper given to her by a reporter to confirm the date of her flight in a Lockheed Vega 5B. After contending with strong northerly winds, icy conditions, and mechanical problems, Earhart landed in a pasture in Culmore, Northern Ireland. The landing was witnessed by Cecil King and T. Sawyers, and when a farmhand asked, "Have you flown far?" Earhart replied, "From America." And there you have it, the Explorers. Today's Daily Dose documentary is brought to you by PlatoSpeech.com, a lesson planning tool leveraging content like this and much more for educators and homeschooling parents. Check out the description for more information so that you too can teach something new every day.